So let me begin by talking about Sophia, who is a very, very mysterious figure in the Jewish and Christian traditions. The most famous church, one of the most famous churches in the world, is called Hagia Sophia. It is in Istanbul, once Constantinople, and it was built as a church to Sophia. I think the Turkish president has turned it into a mosque. It seems to go back and forth between church and mosque, depending on various factors I don't know too much about. But it is a centerpiece of Christian architecture. Here's one image. Now, as this image might suggest, Sophia has a much bigger role in Eastern Orthodoxy than she does in Catholicism or Protestantism. And this is an icon of, this is Sophia from Novgorod, in one of the oldest and most historical cities in Russia. This is Mary, this is John the Baptist, this is Christ the Logos. And if you don't know what Logos means, we'll get to it. So Sophia is a very venerated figure, but one of the most interesting instances of her appearance is in certain scriptures written by the Gnostics, Gnostics, of the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. And they had this extraordinary myth of Sophia. And Sophia was the wisdom of God, but Sophia kind of fell. And she kind of forgot who she was. And in this delusion, she gave birth to an insane, deranged, second-rate god known as the Demiurge, who is the real ruler of this world, according to the Gnostics. And don't forget, even in conventional Christianity, one of the names of Satan is the prince of this world. So this has echoes even in conventional Christianity. But Sophia has to fall and has to be rescued somehow. So what does this all mean? Well, this is the Greek word, Sophia. That's what it looks like in Greek. Originally, it meant skill in a craft, in a very literal sense. And then it came to mean cleverness, and then wisdom, and then learning. Wisdom is the name kind of chiefly given to it. Although you have a little problem here, because, of course, everybody loves wisdom, believes in wisdom, usually erroneously think they have wisdom. It's not really clear what does wisdom mean. Well, I'm not going to talk about its meaning in the English language, but I am going to talk about it in the context of this tradition, which has survived in the Christian and the Jewish worlds in different ways ever since the beginning. So, here is the Bible. I'm not going to read it all to you, but this is Sophia talking. So Sophia, according to the book of Proverbs, helped God create the universe. Some Kabbalistic interpretations of the first verse of Genesis will say, with wisdom, God created the heavens and the earth, because the beginning, somehow she's connected with the beginning. And some of you are familiar with the Kabbalistic tree of life, I'm sure. And of course, that principle is called Chokhmah, which is simply Hebrew for wisdom. But I'm not going to go into the Kabbalistic line of thought here. Well, when he set a compass on the deep, In fact, there are images of God. One I can see think of as from a medieval image of God looking like Jesus Christ, holding a compass. Another, Blake's God holding a compass. Blake's version, by the way, is the demiurge, not the real true God. William Blake, the great poet and artist of England. So, but there's something to do with setting a compass, setting a limit somehow. And this is extremely important in all dimensions of experience. This is important because it's the basis of our experience. Is it the basis of the physical world? Well, it's the basis of how we experience the physical world. Oh, by the way, so we've got beginning is Sophia, and then the Gospel of John, as the beginning was the Logos, in which most English translations, the word Logos is translated as word, which it almost never means in the Greek of any period. Why did it get translated that way? Well, I'm not going to bother with that detail, but it doesn't really mean word. It means lots of things. But here, I'm going to suggest it has a very specific philosophical meaning. So Logos is Sophia. Well, isn't it funny that here we've got the Logos, and here's Sophia. They're kind of, well, let's say, at least in terms of this Russian Orthodox icon, they're very closely connected. And I'm going to suggest that they are essentially the same thing. Because Logos is consciousness as a structuring principle, which I'll explain a little bit more. But what is your consciousness now? You're picking things out from a background, a sea of impressions, colors, sounds, whatever. You're picking out something you're paying attention to, hopefully me, against everything else. You're picking something out as a way of kind of recognizing. I mean, the only way you can recognize me or anything else is by this kind of picking out. And that is what I mean by consciousness as a structuring principle. And if you think about it, this underlies all our experience. But I'm going to go on and say that it underlies everything. Logos is consciousness, and I'm defining consciousness, which is rarely defined at all clearly, by the way, as a distinction between self and other. That is, you're conscious to the extent that you're aware of yourself against this other, which we conveniently call the world, right? If you're not conscious of it, the world, like when you're in deep sleep, well, we say you're not conscious at all. Now, it's not quite so simple because, as I say, this goes throughout the entire universe manifestation at all levels. Who said so? Well, I suppose you can at least consider that late theosophist, he was a theosophist, by the way, Thomas Edison. I'm not going to read this. This is from an interview he did with Harper's Magazine in 1890. And what it's basically saying, that even atoms are possessed by what he calls intelligence. The atoms of hydrogen combined with those other elements forming the most diverse substances. What does that mean? Well, it means at a very basic level, a hydrogen atom has, in some sort of way, as he puts it, intelligence, I would say consciousness, but it comes to the same thing. The intelligence to recognize an oxygen atom with which it binds in certain ways and in certain combinations makes everybody's favorite beverage, which I guess is water. Maybe it's not everybody's favorite beverage, but you really can't get along without it. So he's saying that this process, this intelligence, exists at all levels, including the supposedly inanimate and supposedly primitive atom. As these atoms combine into molecules, these molecules combine into, in certain cases, life forms. The same process goes over and over and over. An amoeba has to recognize an other, usually is either predator or prey. If an amoeba is going to eat, I don't know what they eat, but I guess they eat other single cells, it's going to have to recognize that as food. And if it sees something that it somehow knows eats amoebas, it moves as far as possible in the other direction. So this process continues. It's most obvious in animals, because animals clearly recognize their own environment and how they fit into it, again, often as predator or prey. And we'll get to that subject too in a little bit. So this principle of logos, this consciousness, Sophia, exists in everything. And it's not even possible to imagine a world without it. So that is how Sophia created the world. Now, further details. Madame H.P. Blavatsky, a Russian woman who was really basically the founder of the Theosophical movement. The Theosophical movement goes back to 1875, and she was an extremely gifted and eccentric Russian noblewoman. Some of you may know a lot about her, some of you may not. But in a book called The Secret Doctrine, she set out the principles of what might be called an esoteric science. And one of these principles, in fact, the principle, an omnipresent, eternal, boundless, immutable principle on which all speculation is impossible, it's basically kind of the ground of being. It precedes being, so to speak. It's the absolute. It is most easily imagined as empty space, but empty space is not identical to this principle, out of which everything arises. Does it exist? Well, you can't even say that it exists. You can't say that it doesn't exist. Nothing could be said about it at all. In fact, including, I suppose, the fact that nothing could be said about it at all. Even that's saying something about it. So this is this kind of ground of being, which has many names in many traditions. So, but we can call it the absolute, right? Now, this absolute is prior to this dichotomy of self and other. That is, although everything exists in this way, this is well beyond it. You could say it's eternally unchanged, but I guess then you have to say you're saying something about it, but then you just said you can't say something about it. Can you really say it's changeless? On and on. Now, here is the fall of Sophia. I'm going to discuss this in human terms because this is a human problem. Perhaps it's a problem for amoebas and octopi, octopuses, and all sorts of other creatures, but I think we would do well just to deal with our own predicament, at least at first. Well, actually, why don't you all just close your eyes for a minute or so? you will note probably that a lot of things are going through your mind, only some of which are have to do with my voice. You have a lot of thoughts going on. I'm having a good time. I'm not having a good time. This day is beautiful. I'm worried about my mortgage. I hate my boss. I love my boss. All these thoughts are going through your mind, right? Well, notice that you can sit back and watch this whole stream of consciousness as an observer, right? You can step back and watch it like a movie, right? But if you step back and watch it, if you can do that, it means you are not the stream of consciousness, because there's something else watching it, even though you're usually not aware of it. You can open your eyes whenever you feel like it. And this watcher is called Atman, self with a capital S. It has any number of names in any number of religions and traditions, because if this is true, if what I'm saying is true, it has to be universally true, right? And if it's universally true, it would stand to reason that lots of people would have figured this out in different ways, different times, and different fashions, and applied their own terms to it. That is, in a sense, what the secret doctrine, the ageless wisdom, the ancient wisdom is essentially about. But you forget this, that you can watch this, right? Because you actually think you are your thoughts. You think you are your feelings. You think your body, your body's pains. You identify with these on a day-to-day basis. In fact, the only practical way to step back is through some form of meditative practice. And I think you could argue that many forms of meditative practice are designed precisely to do this, even though their methods may vary. So, this is the myth of Narcissus. Consciousness falls in love with its own images, its own projections. It's submerged in the images it has made. It forgets its identity as an organizing, as a consciousness, and drowns. It dies, as it were, to its own true nature. If you look at a lot of spiritual traditions, the language around death is very, very peculiar, because it sometimes says, well, you kind of have to die in order to be reborn, not necessarily in a literal sense. Well, in one sense, it's also saying that just by this process of just forgetting your own essential nature, you already died. You know, esoterically, in certain terms, when people speak about the dead, they don't mean the people who are in the grave, but the people who are dead in this way. Well, in fact, you will hear this in the gospel, where Christ says, let the dead bury their dead. What do you think he means? He doesn't mean that one corpse is going to bury another corpse. He's talking about this. By the way, all of what I'm saying, if you follow it through, if you look at the Bible, Old and New Testaments, in a certain way through this lens, a lot becomes much clearer than it is, which is an immense topic. But anyway, let's use a visual here. This is Narcissus. And this is an ancient Roman painting from the 1st century AD, found at Pompeii, and only preserved to us because a volcano basically buried the whole city in lava and preserved it for us. These are some of the very few samples of ancient painting we have. I mean, the ancients had great painters, very likely as great as any of the ones that we admire, but none of their works have survived. Only these frescoes in the home of a few Roman millionaires. These homes got buried by lava from Mount Vesuvius in AD 79, were I'll not say miraculously preserved, but they were fortunately preserved, although not perhaps fortunately for the people who were living in Pompeii on that particular day. So, this is the fall of Sophia, right? Yeah. Now, then you have to, but in this state of, shall we say, fallen consciousness, it somehow still has to organize its experience. And it does so by creating, well, categories. We said it had to do with picking things out. And it picks things out into certain categories. Here's the most famous list of categories from Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest philosophers of all time. And this is what he said out. There are 12 categories: unity, plurality, totality, reality, negation, limitation, causality. This is a big one. Let's say the whole concept of causality is the crazy wife in the attic of Western science, which is, again, another huge and even wild topic. But you can see how basic these things are to our experience. No science fiction writer, however daft or creative, has ever imagined a world with no causality. You know, I mean, there's Dune, there's these worms, and there's the sand, and these people killing each other for obscure reasons, but there's still a realm of causality happening in the world of Dune, Star Wars, whatever else you like to imagine. Can you imagine a world in which there's no negation? So, now Kant is not saying this is the way things really are, right? He's saying that this is the way we experience the world, that we structure the world. And he went further and said, you know, it's hard, if not impossible, to imagine what the real world is like behind these categories. And that's another big subject of his philosophy. But you can see how this becomes very, very hard to, as we can say, do without. Maybe, maybe not. Kant's view is that this is kind of rigid, ironclad logic, and that you can't really think past it. And this is to a certain extent true, but there are certain modifications. Like, for example, and I'm not going to read this whole thing. Even logic, he says, this is Bekhterev, a very distinguished and little-known Russian psychologist who, well, is worth a lecture in his own right. But he's saying that even this logic, this is of social origin. That is to say, different societies create these different categories as ironclad as they may seem to us. And there it is, you know. In mythology, a part may equal the whole, or a certain object may exist before the beginning of time, you know. And suddenly all of these categories of Kant in the mythic worldview don't really apply. Why? Because these cultures have their own cognitive structure, social or these have their own cognitive structures, which is the mythic worldview. And that's why, you know, the Europeans who first encountered primitive peoples thought they were very, very dumb and stupid because they understood the world in a completely different way. So here you have, there are two ways of structuring reality. Which is right? Well, what do we know? So, and what is the mythic worldview? Well, here's an example. I don't know if you're familiar with the Huichol Indians of Mexico, the Sierra Madre Occidental in Mexico. They live in a part of the mountains so remote that, the Christians never really bothered to get around to convert them. So they retain their indigenous tradition, and this is it, a version of it. Shamanism. This is the shaman with winds coming out of his belt. This is our elder brother, the blue deer. Yeah, I know, it's not blue. But somehow, that's kind of the mythic worldview. The blue deer is not blue. And somehow the blue deer is identified with this ant-like thing, kind of is and is not that. This woman, who for some obscure offense was transmuted into this thing, which is the tree of wind, a apparently real and existing psychedelic plant that's so powerful that if you get some of its pollen on your skin, you start tripping. Even seasoned psychedelic explorers are a little bit cautious about this one. So you're seeing this whole view, these things kind of exist. One is this, it's not that. This is this, it's not that. This whole concept of the Kantian categories just doesn't really apply. By the way, this image, which is about the size you're seeing it, is on my mantelpiece in my living room. And I bought it years ago, various reasons, but it's very heavy. This is yarn set in beeswax on a wooden frame. So it's this size, so you can imagine how heavy it is. That's why it's on the mantle, because hanging it on the wall, kind of a dicey thing. But this is yet another worldview, right? Another way of structuring reality. And only recently are Western thinkers starting to realize that, well, maybe this isn't quite so bogus as we used to like to think. Well, let's throw in another worldview. This is, in a way, the most obscure, but in a way the most familiar. The Kabbalistic Sefer Yetzirah, which is basically the Book of Formation, written, nobody knows when, but the 3rd, 6th centuries AD is the best guess anyone has come up with. It's a very, very short book. It's only a few pages long. And it's considered to be a very, very obscure and cryptic one. But maybe we can figure out one or two things about it. Ten Sfirot, which can mean something like principle. Blima, well, why didn't I translate it? Because no one really knows what it means. It's a very rare word. The Kabbalists will say, well, bli means without, and ma means what, so it means kind of without what, so sometimes translated of nothingness. Well, what is of the nothingness? The absolute that we were just talking about. And I'm sure many of you have seen the Kabbalistic Tree of Life, and you can certainly buy a poster of one at the Quest bookshop. And there are endless numbers of them online and any other way. But here, there's got the first and the last, good and evil, above and below, east and west, north and south. Well, this is actually the most basic way we structure reality. Because look, you've got above and below, right? You've got 4 directions. And because we're made the way we are, we do see 4 directions, basically front, back, right, left. Maybe an octopus would not see the world that way, but that's something we have no way of knowing about, right? This is, again, human consciousness. So we've got 3 physical dimensions, which are perfectly familiar to everyone. And then you have the first and the last. which means a dimension of time. And time, unlike space, we experience as unidimensional, right? You can only go in one distance, and it's a linear distance, so to speak. So we've got 3 dimensions now of space, 1 dimension of time, but then this little business is left over. What does that have to do with anything? So we got a dimension of time, we have 3 dimensions of space. It almost looks like there's a moral dimension to the universe. Here it is set out, a dimension of good and evil. Well, why would there be a dimension of good and evil? Because if you just take the structure we've had so far, you have a completely static universe. There is no movement in it. So this is the dimension of movement. Good is what you move towards, evil is what you move away from. Yes, I know it's much more complicated than that in daily life, and we all know that, but again, that's another lecture. Or to put it another way, probably the epitaph of the human race is going to be, it seemed like a good idea at the time. You know, and you know perfectly well, you would not even go up and get into the next room unless you thought somehow you would benefit from it, right? Similarly, there's a motion away from. Oh, I guess you could think of it as predator and prey, right? You know, this ice cream is good to eat, I'm going to go toward that. You know, this gallon of turpentine is not good to drink, so I'm going to stay away from that. So this is it. This is good and evil. So our universe is constructed on these 5 coordinates. I don't know what physics will say. Physics often doesn't seem to know what physics today itself is saying, and that's their own business, not mine. But, so we have this motion towards and motion away, and that's the world we have as we experience it. Every human being is kind of submerged in these 10 dimensions, whether they're, the Kantian worldview, the categories, whether they're primitive tribes with mythical, everybody has an above and below, right? Everybody has a front and back. That's why in so many traditions, indigenous and otherwise, the 4 directions are, or the 6 directions. The American Indians speak of the 6 directions. We've seen why. And we all exist in time. Well, what is time anyway? You know, Augustine famously said, if nobody asks me what time is, I know what it is. If somebody asks me something, I don't know. I think most of us are in that position. But sometimes it's said to be the measure of change. And I think that's reasonable. I did write an editorial on this subject for a recent issue of Quest, the magazine which I edit, and some of you may have seen that. So time is the measure of change. Now, what does that mean? Well, what is a year? A year is a relatively constant period of the time it takes for the Earth to move around the sun. Right? That's kind of a fixed point, right? And history has to divide itself into these various years, AD, BC, however it's commuted, you know. X event happened in, 1695. Y event happened in 1795. It's measured against this. So this dimension of movement, in a sense, makes everything possible. Oh, well, this sounds also kind of primitive. There was a Greek philosopher called Empedocles who said that the world was composed of love and strife. And this seems like kind of a groping towards something that might pass as scientific knowledge, but maybe it's a little more scientific than you think. Because those are the words he used, because those are the words available to him. But all you have to say, the world is based on attraction and repulsion. And then, well, there you have the physics you learned in high school. I didn't learn physics in high school, which may be obvious. So, to go back to the Gnostic mythos, all of these are ways in which Sophia is lost, and these are the structures we go about in. And you'll see constantly, over and over again, this idea in philosophy and even in religion that the world we live in is illusory, right, somehow. The doctrine of Plato's cave, where these people, are chained and they're looking at these shadows moving, and they think they're the real thing. That's one of those famous images. So all of this is, in a sense, a delusion that we've made up. And this gets to be a problem for science, because since science is based on all of this, how can it possibly claim to know, to give the definitive picture of reality? I think their answer to that is, we'll get back to you about that. So here's, the Gnostics had these things called the archons, which mean the rulers. And I'm suggesting that what some of them may have meant are that these are the structures of consciousness. 3 fairly basic, but not always mutually consistent ones. And so this is all the creation of Sophia, who's lost or fallen. She's given rise to this monstrous son called the demiurge, and these things called the archons, which are the structures of consciousness. And, I said Logos, Christ and Sophia are essentially the same, or at least they're the same symbolically, in the sense that in the terms of the myth we're talking about, Sophia represents the capacity of consciousness to lose itself in its own experience. One of the meanings of Sophos, Sophia, is cleverness, which sometimes could mean that Sophia is maybe a little too clever for her own good. But consciousness also has the capacity to liberate itself from this illusion. And that's symbolized in the myth by Christ. Now, what this has to do with the historical Jesus Christ is quite another question. But I'm saying that this is, in this language, this is what these things symbolize. Okay. Well, then we get to this demiurge fellow. Who is he? And I am going to discuss it by reading from my book, A Theology of Love. It's kind of a parable. Suppose that a man builds a box and puts mirrors in it on all sides. He sits in the box and closes the lid upon himself. Wherever the man looks, up, down, side to side, he sees countless iterated reflections of himself. He sees nothing else and forgets that there is anything else. The man goes mad. He imagines that each of these reflections is another man, and he thinks their facial expressions are their personalities. He makes an angry face and imagines that this face is another man, angry at him. He smiles and finds a friend. He cries and feels pity for the suffering being he sees. Soon he becomes so absorbed in these images that he forgets he is himself. He no longer remembers his own individuality. He's submerged in the mirror's reflection, and he thinks he is these persons. He becomes what he beholds. His condition deteriorates further. His mind fixates on one of these images, happy or sad, and identifies with it. He becomes this face. He imagines that he is this face looking at all the other faces whom he arbitrarily sees as friends or enemies, strangers or lovers. He becomes so lost in these fantasies that he loses all function, thrashes around in the wildest ways. Strange beings, but people very like us, as Plato said about the people in his cave. This is the book I'm reading from. The condition of the man in the box only lasts a short time, but for him is eternity. The confusion and suffering, punctuated by intermittent joys, seem endless. Finally, someone takes pity on him. This person does not force open the box, which would drive the man still further into madness, but begins speaking to him. It tells him, remember, you are not these crazy reflections that are flashing around. You are who you are. At first, it does no good. The man hears this message and confuses it with his own ravings. Later, he realizes that this voice is not his own, but then he believes it is the maddest thing of all. The voice repeats its message, soothingly but persistently. Sometimes the man hears it as sounds mysteriously coming out of another dimension. Sometimes he thinks it is emitted by one of the faces in the mirrors. Eventually, he starts to trust the voice. He calms down and begins to remember something. At first, he does not even know what. As he settles down, the images begin to stabilize. They move around less. The world becomes quieter. He starts to see the faces in the mirrors not as delusory individuals, but as reflections of himself. He even remembers that he himself built the box. Finally, he is quiet and sane enough to open the box and step out of it into a reality he had forgotten. This weird fable is probably a reasonable approximation of the condition we are in. Now we see who the Gnostic demiurge is. He is not an evil, inferior God out there. He is ourselves. We are the demiurge who has forged this world. Forged, by the way, in both senses of the word, right? We have forgotten this fact, but it makes it no less true.